Welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. This podcast is about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why that's always possible. I'm your host, Michael. Let's get into it. This is episode 5, La Vida Loca. Before moving to Mexico, I'd been spending time for a few months hanging around my friend Taylor's apartment. I was seeing a few girls at the time. One of the girls I was seeing briefly, Katie, had caught me with another girl I was also seeing briefly, Megan, and so that situation quickly terminated. I remember driving past Katie and her friends, and they were just plastered against the glass of her car with looks of pure shock and horror as I slowly drove by. I tried to keep my head straight and pretend like I didn't notice, but we were going past each other at a traffic light at like 10 miles an hour. So I was busted dead to rights. And Megan didn't really like me either. She was just spending time with me to try to get closer to my friend Jack, who she really liked. But I ignored it because at the time I wanted all the attention I could get. And she was willing to give it to me if Jack wasn't interested. But eventually Jack and Megan slept together one of the nights I wasn't around, so I was back to square one. I'd also started talking to a girl named Madison, who I'd met through a mutual friend. Madison and I hadn't spent any real time together, but the night I was leaving for Mexico, she had invited me over. I had told her I was leaving and that I wanted something to remember her by. And so she covered me with kisses. And in the moment, I was really enjoying it. But when I woke up the next morning, I was horrified to see the massive purple bruises just lining the whole of my neck and leaving me looking like I was the victim of some sort of strange crime. She'd given me hickeys just freaking everywhere. I still remember the regretful look of even the flight attendant when I got on the plane to leave that day. What happened to you, sugar? She had asked me sincerely. A paintball game, I had lied back. But one of my friends, Alan Daniels, had given me some large tranquilizers for the flight, and they worked as expected. It wasn't long after closing my eyes that I was waking up dazed on a runway of another country. From my window, I saw German shepherds patrolling the airport. And so I ditched the rest of the tranquilizers in the storage pouch in the front of me, in the front seat. The whole airport security process at the airport in Puerto Vallarta was interesting. It was just different than what I was used to in the U.S. You would sort of stand in this big line and press a button when your turn came up, and the button would either light up red or green. And if it was green, you got to leave the terminal. But if it was red, you were searched. And so I was sweating, my whole way up to the button. I didn't think that I'd taken anything illicit with me. I thought I ditched it all on the plane. But I also didn't want to end up like Brittany Griner on my first trip out of the country. But needless to say, I was okay. And when I finally left the terminal and entered the arrivals section of the airport, I was greeted by a charming Mexican woman holding a sign with my name on it. She had introduced herself as Gabriella, or Gabby for short, and told me that she would be taking me to where I was staying and show me my workstation and introduce me to my other colleagues. I could tell she was trying very hard not to look at my hickeys the entire time we were together. And we left the airport and, the humidity just hit me like a sauna. The sun was hot and the world was bright. She loaded me into a passenger van and proceeded to drive me towards the Iglesia where the nonprofit ran its daily operations. Along the way, she asked, "Michael, do you love Jesus?" And I think she was being sincere. And asking the question out of genuine concern that I might be a rough character. I had a few piercings at the time and hickeys on my neck and probably had the general mystique of a burnout. I was also a burgeoning atheist at the time. Only a few months prior, I had decided spontaneously when riding in the car with my friends that I was no longer going to be believing in God. Mostly because one of the really hot girls in the car said she didn't believe in God first. And so when it was my turn, I had to reciprocate. And I remember in that moment when the words left my mouth, I had almost expected to be struck down right then and there by a lightning bolt through the car. So my faithless assertion was a bit ironic at that time. But facing down Gabriella in the van that day, I lied. I said, yes, I very much love Jesus. And she accepted my response, I think, and we rode on in silence after that until we arrived at the church. The weather was hot there as well, and it was the middle of summer, and I remember sweating through my t-shirt before I even made it through the front gates. The church was two structures, one with a large sanctuary with kind of a white steel-framed building, and the other building looked a bit more traditional with stucco siding and red roofing tiles, traditional of what you might see in Mexican architecture. The walkways were covered with metal scrollwork in iron that also adorned the entry and side doors to allow ventilation while keeping the larger pests outside. There were iguanas hanging from tropical trees, growing up along the gardens and surrounding the cobblestone area as you walked through. It was beautiful, really, and had the appearance of a place that was genuinely well cared for. Volunteers were busy at work all around me. I was led into the kitchen at first, which is sort of served as the entry foyer where most of the volunteers passed through to or from their workday. Kitchen staff were preparing meals for the day, and there was a lead cook who was an older woman in her later 50s who would come each day to prepare a meal for the other staff, who would each pay her a few pesos to eat the meal during lunchtime. And I think from the first moment she met me, she decided she didn't like me. and that was just the way it was. But part of the work that the volunteers did was to round up food donations from various area restaurants, tortillerias, and hotels to bring back to the kitchen and portion up meals to feed the children of the basura, or the dump. And so the kitchen just was always a busy hub of activity. Gabby quickly introduced me to the staff and asked one of the other boys to show me further around and take me to get a bite to eat from the local market. Pancho was his name, and he was from Guatemala. He never really told me how he got there, but he liked Dragon Ball Z, so we bonded early over that shared interest. He showed me around, including the showers, which were outdoors and unheated. I learned early on that if I showered when the sun was at the heat of the day and I only showered for a couple moments, I could actually have a mostly warm shower from the sun that would heat up the pipes on the roof. And so that became my strategy from the first day forward. But I was temporarily provided a room at the church to sleep in at night, and I'd had an air mattress that I'd brought with me. And so that's kind of where he showed me where I would be staying. My first room was used for an old ladies prayer group a few days a week. And it was really early in the morning that they had their prayer group. And so I would always have to get up early and hide all of my bedding to avoid their scowls when they came in the morning. In addition, there was also a small church office where there was this old Dell computer that I had been assured had an internet connection and would be where I did most of my work. Pancho continued the tour, taking me down to the local market to buy me a quesadilla. And I gotta say, to this point in my life, I'd been accustomed only to the kind of quesadillas available at Taco Bell or maybe the local Mazatlan Mexican restaurant. So when I had my first bite of this carne asada quesadilla on a harina tortilla cooked fresh on a flat top from a Mexican market, I just nearly died and went to heaven just right then and there. Every bite was bliss. I thought to myself that I could get used to this pretty quick. on the walk back, he showed me where I could take my laundry to have it washed each week. And we also stopped at a juice vendor with a wagon full of large plastic jugs of agua frescos. And I had some horchata and some other drink for the first time. And I just remember the flavors of Mexico were so immediate and unique, and discovering new food quickly became a newfound form of exploration for me. From the cool glass bottles that drinks were sold in to the crisp produce used in most of the meals, the very tactile feeling of freshness was embedded in the heart of food preparation. And that was just a part of the culture in Mexico. So we rounded our way back to the church, and Pancho dropped me off at the office to start my workday. And I was in big trouble. After a short while at the computer, I quickly realized that I was not capable of doing the work that I'd come to do. Like, I was a pro at making MySpace backgrounds, and I could set up a website using GoDaddy, but this was way out of my league. Someone had clearly coded this site from the ground up, and even their login credentials didn't make sense to me. It was far more of a rudimentary and manual input system than I was used to using. It was kind of an old school website in a way, and I didn't know how to work with it. In my shame, I had to call Mike Parker to tell him that I was way out of my depth. I rang him up and said something like, Mike, I really don't know what I'm doing here. I thought I'd the coding before I left, but this is more than I can follow along with. Well, damn. I'll figure out something for you to do instead. Is that okay? He told me back. And I said, that's okay. And so for the first few weeks there, I just spent time waiting around trying to learn what my purpose would eventually be. I tried to stay useful anyways. So I would ask the other local volunteers how I could help out and stay a helpful participant. They would tell me to ride along for food pickups and to go along with the work crews at the schools to help with the landscaping. And white guy as I was, each time I mowed a lawn in the middle of a Mexican suburb, the irony wasn't lost on me. The locals thought it was funny too. How the tables had turned. I had a poor attitude though the first few weeks. I didn't understand why I was treated like such an outsider by the other locals, the volunteers, and even the church folk. It felt like I was dealing with microaggressions sort of at every turn. There was this Mexican-Italian boy named Fino who would always be trying to ruffle my feathers. He would throw dead insects at me while we were working or knock over my bin of yard waste that I'd gathered up when he walked by, sort of kicking it as he went past. Or he would blow dust on my food when I was eating. He was just always trying to stir the pot and get a reaction out of me. Unfortunately, I always gave him the reaction he was looking for. And so his antics kept on. Every time I would blow my top, it would happen again. But I just always had this general feeling from most of the people around the church and the nearby community that I wasn't well liked, at least not at first. The cook would always scowl when I'd arrived in the morning each day for work, and the other kitchen staff would comment at how unhealthy or skinny I was. And when they saw that I would get frustrated at their comments, they would only then redouble their efforts the next day, pinching my belly and reading the calories on the labels of any snacks I was eating at any given moment to try to pour salt in the wound. And the way conversations always lowered or shifted from English to Spanish with quiet voices when I entered the room gave me the general sense that I wasn't really welcome there. I would hear, ¿Quién es este tonto chico americano? Or, ¿por qué está aquí? Or, ¿cuándo se va? Just little comments that would dig. A few weeks into my torment, I asked one of the locals, Ruben, why everyone was so hard on me. And he told me a story about how once he was riding in a bus with a new guitar, and the guitar slipped out of his hands. And he said that as he reached to grab the falling guitar, the strings cut across his face, leaving new wounds in the shape of a scratch. And everyone had thought that he'd been in a fight with a woman. And so everywhere he would go, he was judged by the community and treated poorly for it. It only took me a moment to realize he was referring to my hickeys from a few weeks before, and that the poor treatment I was receiving was because I was being judged as someone of low character. Even though my hickeys were now gone, the memory of them wasn't gone, at least from the locals I was serving. And I realized that I was going to have to rebuild trust the only real way I knew how, which was just by working hard. I wasn't just going to have to prove to each of them that I was capable of doing good things, even if they couldn't see it yet. I don't think I really understood it then, but they didn't have really any reason to believe that I was anything but trouble. I probably looked like shit when I arrived. I was underweight and not exactly taking good care of myself. I had an attitude and a chip on my shoulder, and I felt that anyone who was rude to me was just out to get me. I was still a kid, and I'd been through a lot of self-imposed hardship, and so some of that trauma was being carried around with me. And I surely had a lot of growing up ahead of me. So I don't think it was unfair that I was being treated with distrust, or certainly the amount of distrust that I received. But at the time, I wouldn't have agreed with myself now. I was frustrated, and I wanted them to believe me. So I just kept working hard. I kept showing up every day, trying to earn their trust. I would mow lawns. I would trim hedges. I would scrub the walls. I would clean the classrooms. I set up computers for them. I set up the networks. I picked up food donations. I cleaned up yard waste. I delivered and set up meals at the dumps for the kids. So I was highly invested in doing good work. And Ruben and I developed some kinship over the time that he was working with me, as he was really my primary means of transportation to and from our work sites. He really appreciated American music, and the way he would delight in a well put together song made me genuinely happy. His two favorites were What's Up by the Four Non Blondes and Hotel California by the Eagles. He would pull them up on YouTube in the computer room at the school where we were working and turn the speakers to 11 and close his eyes and just let the music fall over him. What's going on? He would say in this heavily accented English. But we had a good time hanging out together. And Ruben was about 20 years my senior, though, and he was married with children. So we were just kind of at different phases in life. And so as much as I enjoyed his companionship, I still felt a sense of loneliness at the time. On one of our dump runs, so I did meet a new volunteer named Harrison. He was from England and was studying to be a nutritionist. He had come over with a group of graduate students and volunteers who are working with a sort of Peace Corps equivalent organization that was somehow tied to education. I still don't totally understand it, but I know he was there as a nutritionist, and it was a part of his study program in some way to be there. And he had other roommates who were studying different things, like one was studying crocodiles while another was teaching developmentally disabled kids. So it was really a mixed bunch, and they were all from different places across the UK. And they just lived a bit down the way from my place. Harrison was the first British person I'd ever met. He was a little bit older than me, but not by much, more than 5 or 6 years. And he was a black guy and just had this really cool accent, but it made his Spanish sound painful. He'd been down there a few weeks already and hadn't made any friends yet beyond his roommates, and I was sort of in the exact same boat. So we became fast friends. We'd sort of talked through our workday about music we knew and liked, and I was relieved to have someone who could be a potential friend. He seemed nice enough and asked if I wanted to head down to a local pub to play a round of billiards. I had still a few years before I could legally drink in the U.S. And so I was already hoping and pining for a chance to go out to one of the local bars, just to have a drink up to that point. And so I eagerly accepted the offer. And we just had a terrific time. We shot the shit, talked about rap groups like Jurassic 5 and how shitty the overlords were who we were working for at the church. It was pretty surreal, to be honest. I was sitting in Mexico, drinking tecates in a bar and playing billiards with a new friend from England. And it was like the first time in over a month that I felt like I was actually having fun. Prior to arriving, I had told myself that I was going to quit smoking cigarettes, but they happened to be under $2 a pack in Mexico, which is extremely cheap. And so Harrison also smoked as well. So I picked the habit right back up. He called them fags, and I thought that was kind of funny. I still do. We just had fun that night. We met a Mexican guy at the bar that offered to sell us some cocaine. Harrison appropriately asked, well, how do we know you're not a cop? And he nodded to himself as if he had thought up really a clever question. And the guy responded by saying, would a cop have a tattoo like this? Revealing this giant pot leaf across his left pec. Touche, I added. And then sort of wondered to myself how often he used that line. And I guessed probably all the time. But we bought some cocaine from the pot leaf chested stranger in the bar and walked back to Harrison's apartment where I met his other roommates. One of his roommates was this really rude Scottish lady who was rather pretty, but genuinely a bit of a snob. She just spent most of her time bringing, different guys back to the apartment and would then complain about any uptick in noise from the living room. And so we all kind of had to tiptoe around on eggshells whenever she was around. But that night, Harrison and I were joined by his other roommate, Lillian, and we all just snorted cocaine before returning to a night out. We explored much of Puerto Vallarta's back streets, meeting locals, sharing drinks with strangers, just having a fun time. I remember at one point we decided to part ways and return to our separate apartments. And I was going to take the canals from downtown home, but I felt this genuine and unsubstantiated concern that one of the local crocodiles was going to jump out of the dark and eat me that night. So instead, I caught a ride in the back of a truck from a stranger at a stoplight until I was just a few blocks from my apartment and knocked on the roof for them to stop and jumped out and walked a few more minutes until I was home safe. Later that week, when I returned to work with Harrison, I learned that on his way home that night, he didn't have as much luck. He'd been followed by a strange car in the dark, and we had both been warned previously as foreign volunteers that we were, that there was a few notorious human traffickers with operations in the area. They supposedly had associations with some of the local cartels, and so we were always cautioned to be vigilant of our surroundings. I specifically remember being told, if anyone tries to signal you for help on the side of the road, keep driving. It's a trick used by the traffickers. And so that was kind of always in the back of my mind all the time, that I could get kidnapped if I wasn't careful. But anyways, Harrison was walking home that night and was slowly being followed by a car at around 3 or 4 in the morning. And so he didn't know what to do and just panicked and started running at full speed in the opposite direction. Well, it wasn't human traffickers that morning. Rather, it was the police. Quickly, they flashed their sirens and detained him for several hours while trying to interrogate the guy who was running from the police. And Harrison's Spanish was terrible, and so I can only imagine the difficulties he went through that night to try and reassure them of his mistake. It was his accent that made it he had just awkward pronunciation. But also genetically, I don't think he could roll his R's, which always just makes it that much harder to speak Spanish. Now, he could understand Spanish just fine. It was just the speaking part that he really struggled with, at least initially. He eventually apparently paid the police some cash that night and they let him on his way. But after that, I think we were both a bit more careful about our late night walks home. I mostly walked around, though, town just to get around. I was pretty limited by my lack of resources. When I moved there, I didn't have anything in my bank account, and I was collecting $50 a week as a stipend for my work from Mike Parker. I'd been promoted from landscaping to teaching ESL, English Second Language, at one of the schools managed by the nonprofit, as the opportunity sort of came out of nowhere. The school had expanded to a second campus, and they needed someone who could speak clear English and help the children in learning conversational words. I always had a knack with kids. I had younger siblings and my cousin, so I was good with kids. And I'd even earned my babysitting license from Campfire Girls when I was 13. So I knew I was fine and I'd be adept, and the opportunity seemed like fun. So I volunteered when it had arrived. It didn't pay any more than the $50 a week stipend that I was already earning. But instead of landscaping, I would be doing teaching, to grade school kids, which seemed like a fun opportunity. At the time, Harrison was sick of the volunteer work he'd been assigned to, which was mostly kitchen duty. He was studying nutrition and sort of took issue with the daily meals of ultra-processed food, including white bread and cheap mayonnaise and plastic-wrapped Kraft cheese that lacked in any meaningful nutrition. And the church overlords weren't interested in any recommendations from him as to a change in practice. So he would, stomp around frustrated often enough at what he was forced to tolerate. But I decided to invite him to work the classroom with me. And so we ended up co-instructing about 30 kids on any given day in basic English. After a while, the church that ran the daily operations decided to no longer provide me room and board. While I had won over many of the locals and church community who had initially shunted me, there were a few higher-ups at the church who were pretty eager to see me go, particularly the cook. So I moved out with a few other locals who were working at the church to an apartment nearby. Now, keep in mind, I didn't pick my living arrangements. I was just sort of told by the overlords at the church that I couldn't stay there any longer, but that I could stay at this other place nearby if I didn't want to go home. I would have loved to rent something different on my own, but at $50 a week, I was hardly covering the cost of food and laundry. My apartment was a porcelain storage closet for one of the local businesses. And so it was just lined floor to ceiling with glasswares. It had one bedroom and a living room area and a bathroom, but there was no doors and no furniture. The windows were open air with no glass, and so I routinely had geckos and sugar ants for house guests. But it was okay. I set up my air mattress in one of the bedrooms to share with my roommate Javier. And it was, cozy enough. None of us could afford to buy gas, however, from the local gas trucks. They would circle the blocks with hundreds of green tanks of propane and a loudspeaker like some sort of gruesome ice cream truck, yelling, "El gas!" From loudspeakers just attached to the roof of the trucks. So we didn't buy any gas, and instead we had cold showers and no working stove. So in lieu of having a stove, I decided I'd eat most of my meals at the local church where a cook would prepare lunch for volunteers to purchase for a few pesos a day. In the evenings, I would usually buy a hamburguesa from a local stand that was nearby, or maybe pick up a bag of chips or a pack of beef jerky on my way home. The girl who ran the hamburguesa stand was nice, and I would always stop to talk with her, and that was kind of a routine for me a few days a week. I found it hard to make ends meet, though, while still being able to pay for laundry or buy a bottle of soda once in a while. And so I had to ration pretty hard, and I would take free food opportunities virtually whenever they were available to me. I would get expired pan donations from the local bakery, which were these kind of like colored frosted donuts. And I would eat those most mornings to save money. And I saved some extra money after all my other expenses, or at least I managed to still buy a couple of beers at the pool hall at the end of the week. The beers were sold by the can, and they were super cheap. And so every week I seemed to manage to just have enough to feed myself and still buy a beer or two. And once a month I would buy a $2 pack of smokes and nurse those, here and there whenever I could. But I rationed everything pretty hard. And all the while I slept on an air mattress, and I used a cheap Coleman sleeping bag for my blanket. So I would say it was a really simple life. Just a simple life. After starting to settle in, I was bitten, however, by something that crawled through the window of my apartment. And everyone believed it was a scorpion based on the marks, but I couldn't be certain because I never actually saw it. My foot did swell up, though, like the Elephant Man. I mean, I looked seriously ill. My foot lost all definition, and my leg took on the appearance of like a giant skin club. I developed stretch marks from where my skin was pulling open at the seams, and the locals started to fear that I was taking a turn for the worse. They had me soak my foot in near boiling hot water with this strange mixture of leaves and acting as sort of a poultice, and it did nothing. So finally, they resorted to some sort of shot or injection that they procured from one of the local farmacia CMEQs. And they had me lay out, I remember, on the table. It was like a dining room table where the meals were fed to volunteers. And they pulled off the tablecloth and had me pull down my pants and underwear and just stabbed me in what I can only describe as the most painful shot of my entire life. "Take it out! Take it out! Take it out!" I screamed. "Esta fuera! Esta fuera! Esta fuera!" The cook screamed back at me. It felt like she had stabbed a knife into my ass and wiggled it around, and that somehow I'd been simultaneously injected with like gelatin, and it was just freely moving around my ass cheek. I will never forget that pain. It only lasted for a few minutes, but the swelling did go down, and within a few days I was able to walk again and ultimately return to work. As I was teaching English, I was also learning Spanish, and so the learning was really reciprocal in that way. I spent most mornings preparing lesson plans to take to class later in the afternoon. I tried to use materials from the other school's ESL teacher, and then I would combine them with what was available to me online. I genuinely really worked hard on those lesson plans. I started most of my classes by writing a few words of the day on the chalkboard, words like thank you, or you're welcome, or Monday. And the students would come in and we would all practice saying them together. It was challenging at first, though, because I couldn't speak Spanish. And those little devils would run circles around me by just cracking jokes in Spanish that they knew I didn't understand. They thought it was hilarious, and I had no idea what they were saying. But little by little, my Spanish improved until their jokes didn't work any longer, to their disappointment. I found that just like spinning a basketball on my finger. If I was determined to learn Spanish, I could do it. I would write down words I would hear around town and take them back to look them up in my Spanish to English dictionary, or later ask a friend, hey, what's this word mean? One of the girls from the church initially had tutored me on Saturday mornings to help me along. But when she wasn't available, I would still practice my Spanish by just speaking to anyone who would talk to me. My Spanish was very broken, and as I primarily struggled with the verb conjugation part of the Spanish, still do. But when speaking, I imagined I sounded about like Borat to anyone listening, but I pushed on and I kept working at it. I would watch telenovelas and American movies that were dubbed in Spanish, and that was a helpful way for me to learn new words while improving my accent. Over time, I really started to develop some proficiency in the language, though. And as my Spanish improved, the world down there really started to open up for me. Thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story. Proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like and subscribe below if you haven't already. Until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live.